Naomi Carter had spent the last 5 years in survival mode. She wasn't just a single mother. She was a fighter, a survivor, and a woman who had learned to push through the worst of circumstances for the sake of her son, Ethan. At 28 years old, she had faced more challenges than most people did in a lifetime. It wasn't supposed to be this way. She had once dreamed of becoming a professional dancer, of performing on grand stages, feeling the rush of the audience's applause. But dreams had a way of crumbling when reality hit. Her pregnancy had forced her to abandon her ambitions, and with no support from Ethan's father, she had learned to stand on her own 2 feet. Now, she spent her days juggling shifts at Blue Rose Cafe, a small but cozy place tucked away in a quiet corner of Los Angeles. The pay was barely enough to cover rent, groceries, and Ethan's medical expenses, and now it seemed even that was slipping away from her grasp. Naomi clenched her jaw as she stared at the piece of paper in her hands, a formal notice from her landlord. Final warning before eviction. Her stomach twisted. There was no safety net, no backup plan. If she lost her apartment, she and Ethan would have nowhere to go. As if sensing her distress, Ethan tugged on her sweater. "Mommy, are we gonna be okay?" he asked in his small, innocent voice. Naomi forced a smile and ruffled his curly hair. "Of course, baby. Everything's going to be just fine." But even as she said the words, she didn't believe them. The next evening, the cafe bustled with its usual crowd, locals, tourists, and regulars who came in for their late-night coffee. Naomi moved swiftly between tables, her mind elsewhere. And then she saw him, sitting in the same corner as before. The man from last night was waiting. He was even more striking up close. His sharp jawline, neatly trimmed beard, and piercing dark eyes gave him an air of quiet authority. There was something regal about him, something that made him stand out from the crowd. He wasn't just wealthy, he was powerful. As Naomi hesitated near the counter, one of the other waitresses nudged her. "That guy's been watching you all night," she whispered. "He doesn't look like the type to just come in for coffee." Naomi swallowed hard and approached his table. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, her voice steady despite her nerves. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her, as if trying to read her like an open book. Finally, he spoke. "You're Naomi Carter." It wasn't a question. She nodded. "And you are." He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. Zayn Malik. The name sounded familiar, but Naomi couldn't immediately place it. She had never been the type to follow celebrity gossip or the business world, but she had heard whispers of him, an elusive billionaire with investments across the globe. "What do you want?" she asked, keeping her voice guarded. Zayn studied her for another moment, before sliding a small envelope across the table. "Inside, you'll find an opportunity, one that could change your life." Naomi hesitated before picking up the envelope. She opened it carefully and found a neatly folded note inside. The words were short, but powerful. "Meet me tomorrow at 9 p.m. My estate in Beverly Hills. Come alone." She looked up at him, her heart pounding. "And if I say no?" Zayn's lips curled into a slight smirk. "Then you'll walk out of here, go back to your life, and continue struggling to make ends meet. But if you say yes—" He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just enough to make her shiver. "You might just find a way to give your son the future he deserves." Naomi clenched the note in her hand. Every instinct in her body screamed that this was a bad idea, that a man like Zayn Malik didn't just hand out opportunities without expecting something in return. But then she thought about Ethan, about his growing medical bills, about the nights she had gone to bed, hungry just so he could eat. And just like that, The decision was made. "I'll be there," she said. Zane nodded approvingly. "I look forward to it." As Naomi turned and walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made a deal with the devil. But if the devil was offering salvation, who was she to refuse? Naomi had never felt more out of place in her entire life. The towering wrought iron gates of Zayn Malik's estate loomed before her, an unspoken warning of the world she was about to enter. She hesitated for a brief moment, gripping the strap of her worn-out purse as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. What the hell am I doing here? But then she thought of Ethan, his tiny frame curled under a thin blanket, his tired little face after yet another restless night. If there was even the slightest chance that this meeting could change their lives, she had to take it. With a deep breath, Naomi stepped forward. A uniformed guard eyed her with a neutral expression before nodding to someone inside the security booth. The gates swung open with an almost eerie silence, and Naomi walked in, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. The estate was breathtaking. Acres of manicured gardens, pathways lined with flickering lanterns, and a grand mansion that looked like something out of a movie. The entrance alone was bigger than her entire apartment. She had no idea what she had expected, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. A butler in a crisp black suit greeted her at the door, his voice polished and professional. "Mr. Malik is expecting you, Miss Carter. Please, follow me." Naomi swallowed hard and stepped inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, she felt like she had entered another world. The interior of the mansion was a blend of old-world opulence and modern sophistication. Marble floors gleamed under the warm glow of a massive chandelier, and intricate gold details adorned the walls. Everything screamed wealth, but not the kind that was flaunted. It was the kind that was simply there, undeniable and absolute. She was led through a long hallway, passing rooms so extravagant they seemed almost unreal. And then finally, the butler stopped in front of a set of heavy wooden doors. He knocked twice before pushing them open. Naomi stepped inside. Zayn Malik stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to her, looking out at the sprawling cityscape below. He was dressed casually tonight, dark slacks, a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms. Despite herself, Naomi noticed the way the dim lighting cast sharp shadows on his features, making him look both dangerous and impossibly alluring. "You came," Zayn said without turning around. His voice was low, smooth, commanding. Naomi crossed her arms, trying to mask her nervousness. "You gave me a choice," she said. "But we both know I never really had one, did I?" At that, Zayn turned. His dark eyes locked onto hers, unreadable. "I don't force anyone to do anything, Naomi," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're here because you want to be." Naomi let out a humorless laugh. "Let's skip the mind games, okay? Just tell me what this offer is." Zayn studied her for a long moment before gesturing toward the seating area. "Sit." She hesitated but eventually sat down on one of the luxurious leather chairs. Zayn took a seat across from her and leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "I have an event coming up," he began. "A private gathering for some of my closest associates." Naomi frowned. "Okay. And what does that have to do with me?" Zayn's lips twitched, almost as if he found her skepticism amusing. "I need a performer," he said. "Someone who can dance." Naomi's breath hitched. A dancer. For a split second, memories of her past life flooded her mind. The passion, the thrill of movement, the way the music used to pulse through her veins. But that life had been left behind a long time ago. She shook her head. "I haven't danced in years." Zayn's expression didn't change. "That's not a problem. I have professionals who will train you. Naomi narrowed her eyes. And if I say no? Zane leaned back, his gaze steady. Then, you walk away from here exactly as you came, struggling to survive, worrying about whether your son will have enough to eat tomorrow. He paused, letting his words sink in before adding, or you accept, and you never have to worry about money again. Naomi's fingers clenched against her lap. How much? She asked. Zane didn't blink. $100,000 for the first performance. If you continue, the payments increase. Naomi's stomach twisted. That was more money than she had ever seen in her entire life. It was enough to pay off every bill, secure a future for Ethan, and finally breathe. But something about this didn't sit right. You're offering me $100,000 to dance? She asked, suspicion lacing her voice. Yes. Why me? Zane was silent for a moment before he finally said, because you have something rare. Naomi's brow furrowed. And what's that? Zane's gaze was intense. The way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. She wanted to laugh. She wanted to tell him he was crazy. But deep down, something about this man's words unsettled her. She had spent years feeling invisible, struggling just to get by. And now, in this moment, under this man's gaze, she felt seen. One performance, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Zane nodded. One performance. Naomi took a deep breath and reached for the contract he slid across the table. She skimmed through the pages, clauses about confidentiality, professionalism, no physical contact. It all seemed legitimate. Still, her instinct screamed at her that there was something more to this. All right, she said, grabbing the pen. And with that single signature, Naomi Carter stepped into a world she didn't yet understand. A world that would change everything. Later that night, Naomi lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. She had made a deal with the devil, and now there was no turning back. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that Zayn Malik wasn't the only one watching her, and that somewhere, in the shadows of his grand estate, secrets were waiting to be unraveled, secrets that would shake her world to its core. Naomi stood in front of the mirror in the dressing room, her reflection staring back at her with a mix of uncertainty and defiance. The emerald green dress clung to her curves, its gold embroidery shimmering under the warm lights. Delicate veils adorned her arms, and the golden anklet bells chimed softly every time she shifted her weight. This wasn't her, or at least, this hadn't been her for a long time. Her heart pounded as she adjusted the fabric, trying to push away the nagging voice in her head, screaming at her to run. But it was too late for second thoughts. She had signed the contract. She had made a deal. And now she had to follow through. A gentle knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Miss Carter, you're on in 5. A female voice called from the hallway. Naomi took a deep breath and forced herself to stand taller. For Ethan, she reminded herself. Everything is for Ethan. With a final glance at her reflection, she turned and stepped out of the dressing room. The grand ballrooms was unlike anything Naomi had ever seen before. Golden chandeliers cast a soft, ethereal glow over the polished marble floor. Velvet drapes cascaded from ceiling to floor, framing the luxurious seating area where Zayn and his guests sat. The room was intimate, exclusive, filled with men in finely tailored suits and women draped in silk and diamonds. Zayn sat at the center of it all, his presence commanding attention even in a room full of powerful people. His dark eyes found Naomi the moment she entered, and he watched her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. This is it. The music began. a slow and hypnotic melody that flowed like liquid gold. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief second, grounding herself before allowing her body to move. She had been trained in classical dance once, before life had hardened her, before survival had become her only priority. And now, as she moved, it was as if she was remembering a language she had long forgotten. Her arms glided through the air, the veils floating with her movements like whispers of silk. Her steps were deliberate, precise, each motion telling a silent story. The soft chime of the ankle bells punctuated the rhythm, adding an air of enchantment to the performance. The room was silent, entranced. Zane's gaze never wavered. But Naomi felt something else, another pair of eyes watching her. As the last note of the music faded, Naomi lowered herself into a graceful bow, her breath coming in soft, steadying gasps. The silence that followed was deafening. And then, applause. Quiet at first, then growing, the sound filling the room with an energy that sent goosebumps along Naomi's skin. "Impressive," Zane finally said, his deep voice cutting through the air. Naomi straightened, meeting his gaze. There was something in his eyes, something unreadable. But before she could dwell on it, another voice spoke up. That was quite a performance. The words were cool, almost mocking. Naomi turned her head slightly to see a woman standing near Zane's table. Sophia Rashid, dressed in an elegant crimson gown. She exuded an aura of authority and effortless sophistication. But her eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto Naomi with something that felt dangerously close to disdain. Sophia smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I can see why you chose her, Zane. She certainly has potential." Naomi forced herself to remain composed. She had dealt with women like Sophia before, women who saw her as a threat before even knowing her. But something told her that Sophia's dislike ran deeper than simple jealousy. "She did more than meet my expectations," Zane said, his voice carrying an edge of finality. Sophia's smile tightened, but she said nothing more. Naomi dipped her head slightly in acknowledgement before turning to leave the room. But as she walked past Zane, his voice stopped her. "Naomi." She turned, her heartbeat picking up. "You'll continue?" It wasn't a question. Naomi hesitated. She had agreed to one performance. And yet, standing there, under Zane's scrutinizing gaze, she knew that walking away was no longer an option. "Understood," she said softly. Zane gave her the slightest nod before she exited. But the moment she stepped out into the empty hallway, a chilling whisper stopped her in her tracks. "You have no idea what you've just gotten yourself into." Naomi spun around. Sophia stood in the shadows, her arms crossed over her chest. "What do you mean?" Naomi asked, narrowing her eyes. Sophia took a slow step closer, her lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smirk. "You think this is just about dancing?" she said quietly. "You're a fool if you believe that." Naomi clenched her jaw. "If you have something to say, say it." Sophia tilted her head slightly, as if debating how much to reveal. Then she leaned in just enough for Naomi to hear her next words. "You should leave while you still can." And with that, Sophia turned on her heel and disappeared down the corridor, leaving Naomi standing there, her heart pounding with a mixture of confusion and unease. That night, Naomi couldn't sleep. She replayed Sophia's words over and over again in her mind. "You should leave while you still can." Was it a warning? A threat? And why had Zane looked at her that way? Like he knew something she didn't. Unable to shake the feeling of being watched, Naomi quietly slipped out of her room and made her way toward the balcony that overlooked the estate gardens. The night air was cool against her skin. The city lights stretching out in the distance. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to breathe. But just as she turned to go back inside, something caught her attention. In the reflection of the glass door, she saw a figure standing in the shadows, watching her. Her breath caught in her throat as she spun around, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. A chill ran down her spine. She had been alone for years. She knew what it felt like. But tonight, in the grand estate of Zayn Malik, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't alone anymore. And whatever game she had just stepped into, it was only just beginning. Naomi sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the moonlit cityscape through the floor-to-ceiling window of her lavish guest room. The night was silent, yet her mind was anything but. Sophia's words echoed in her ears. "You have no idea what you've just gotten yourself into." And then, there was that eerie feeling of being watched. The shadow in the hallway, the presence that had vanished before she could confirm it. Something wasn't right. She had always trusted her instincts, and right now, every fiber of her being was screaming that she was walking on dangerous ground. But she wasn't here for herself. She was here for Ethan. She placed a hand over the necklace she always wore, the one with Ethan's initials engraved on the small pendant. No matter what, I have to see this through. The following morning, Naomi awoke to the sound of her phone vibrating against the wooden nightstand. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Hello?" A brief silence, then a deep voice. "Zayn's. Meet me in my study." Naomi frowned. "Now?" "Yes, now." Before she could ask why, the line went dead. Something in his tone unsettled her. It wasn't the smooth, commanding voice he usually carried. It was sharper, more urgent. Naomi followed the butler down a long corridor, leading to a set of heavy wooden doors. The butler knocked once, before pushing them open, revealing Zayn standing by the window, his back to her. "Close the door," he said without turning around. Naomi hesitated, then obeyed. Zayn finally turned, his expression unreadable. "Have you spoken to anyone since last night?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. Naomi's brow furrowed. "Number why?" Zayn studied her for a moment, as if searching for something. Then, without a word, he slid a folder across the desk toward her. "Look inside." Heart pounding, Naomi opened the folder. Inside were photographs of her and Ethan. One was from months ago, taken outside her apartment building. Another showed her holding Ethan's hand as they walked down a grocery store aisle. But the last photo made her blood run cold. It was from last night, a blurry, zoomed-in image of her standing on the balcony of her guest rooms, taken from a distance. She looked up at Zayn, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who took these?" His jaw tightened. "I don't know, but I intend to find out." Naomi felt her pulse race. "You think someone is following me?" "I don't think, Naomi. I know." Later that day, Naomi found herself wandering through the garden, trying to process everything. Someone was watching her. But who? And why? As she turned a corner, she nearly collided with Sophia. Naomi instinctively tensed, expecting another cryptic remark, but Sophia simply crossed her arms and smirked. "Zayn called you into his office, didn't he?" Naomi kept her expression neutral. "What's it to you?" Sophia let out a soft laugh. "Oh, nothing. I just find it amusing how quickly he's gotten invested in you." Naomi's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" Sophia took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Tell me something, Naomi. Have you ever wondered why Zayn offered you that contract?" Naomi's breath caught. "What?" "He could have hired anyone. Dozens of women would have jumped at the opportunity. So why you?" Naomi clenched her fists. "If you have something to say, just say it." Sophia's smirk deepened. "I already did." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Naomi standing there, her mind spinning. That evening, Naomi couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in her gut. Zane had chosen her for a reason, and Sophia clearly knew something she didn't. Determined to find answers, Naomi did something reckless. She walked into Zane's private study when he wasn't there. She wasn't planning to steal anything, just look. But what she found made her blood freeze. On his desk, amidst scattered documents, was a sealed envelope with a single name written on it. Ethan Carter, her son's name. Trembling, she reached for it. But before she could touch it, the door slammed shut. She spun around. Zane stood there, his eyes dark and unreadable. "What are you doing?" Naomi's heart pounded. "Why do you have my son's name on an envelope?" For the first time since she had met him, Zane looked truly caught off guard. But before he could respond, another voice interrupted. "I can answer that." Naomi and Zane both turned to see Sophia, standing in the doorway, and in her hand she held a piece of paper, a DNA test. A heavy silence filled the room. Naomi stared at the document in Sophia's hands, her breath catching in her throat. "What is that?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Sophia took her time stepping forward, a slow, deliberate smirk playing on her lips. "This, my dear Naomi, is a truth you've been blind to." Naomi's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to stay standing. She turned to Zane, who hadn't spoken a word since Sophia's entrance. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Naomi's voice wavered. "Zane, what is she talking about?" Sophia's smirk widened as she held the paper up between her fingers. "According to this very reliable DNA test, your son, little Ethan, isn't just your child." She let the words hang in the air before delivering the final blow. "He's also Zane's." Naomi's world tilted, her vision blurred. She heard the words, understood them, but she couldn't process them. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. She staggered backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Zane finally stepped forward. "Naomi." But she shook her head. "No," she whispered. Zane reached for her, but she jerked away. "Don't." Sophia let out a quiet chuckle. "Well, this just got interesting." Naomi turned to her, fire burning in her veins. "Shut up." Sophia raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Naomi turned back to Zane. "You knew, didn't you?" Her voice trembled. "You knew, and you lied to me." Zane's jaw clenched. "I didn't know for sure." Naomi let out a bitter laugh. "But you suspected." A beat of silence. Then softly, "Yes." Naomi felt something inside her break. This wasn't just about a contract anymore. This wasn't just about dancing. This was about her son, her entire life. She took one last look at Zane, at the man who had turned her world upside down, before stepping back. "I'm leaving," she whispered. And then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Zane standing in the wreckage of the truth. Naomi stormed down the hallway, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Her vision was blurred, her breath came in short, erratic gasps, and her hands trembled at her sides. "Ethan, Zane, DNA test." The words looped in her mind like a broken record, an unbearable echo of a truth she hadn't seen coming. She felt betrayed. She felt blindsided. She stumbled into her room and slammed the door shut, locking it behind her. She needed air. Oh, she needed space. She needed time to process the impossible. Ethan was Zane's son. Her hands went to her head, fingers tangling in her hair as she tried to steady herself, but the ground beneath her feet felt unstable. How? How? She tried to piece it together 6 years ago. That night, a one-night stand, a blurred memory of someone she could barely recall. Number it couldn't be, but it was. A knock on the door shattered her thoughts. She ignored it. Another knock, louder this time. Naomi! Zane's voice. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her back against the door, as if she could physically keep him out. Go away, she said, her voice cracking. I won't. His tone was firm. You need to hear me out. I don't need to hear anything. She heard him sigh on the other side. I didn't lie to you, Naomi. She laughed bitterly. That's funny, because it sure as hell feels like you did. I didn't know for certain, but you suspected. A pause. A guilty silence. Yes, he admitted. I suspected. Naomi's chest tightened. And you didn't think I deserved to know? Another silence, then softer. I was going to tell you. Naomi scoffed. When? After you bought a second DNA test? After you had complete control over me? That's not what this is. His voice hardened. I didn't want to tell you until I was sure. Well, now, you're sure, she snapped. So, congratulations, Zane. You got what you wanted. Now leave me alone. A long beat of silence. And then, he said something that made her breath hitch. I'm not leaving, Naomi. Because Ethan is my son, too. The words sliced through her like a blade. Naomi's hands curled into fists as a sharp, overwhelming fear gripped her. Number Zane might be Ethan's father by blood, but she had raised him. She had fought for him. She had sacrificed everything for him. Ethan was her son. Not Zane's, not his. She wouldn't let him take Ethan from her. She couldn't. She didn't trust herself to speak, so she turned and walked away from the door. She heard Zane exhale sharply, as if frustrated. But after a long pause, his footsteps finally retreated. Only then did she let herself collapse onto the bed, pressing her face into the pillow as silent tears soaked into the fabric. The next morning, Naomi woke to the sound of her phone vibrating. She barely had time to process the exhaustion weighing on her before she saw the caller ID. Unknown number. Something in her gut twisted. She hesitated, then answered. Hello? A deep voice came through the line. Cold, unfamiliar. Leave him, Naomi. Her blood ran cold. Excuse me? Leave Zayn Malik, the voice said, calm yet dripping with warning. Or we'll make you. The line went dead. Naomi stared at the phone in shock. Her breath stuck in her throat. What the hell was that? She immediately turned to Ethan, still sleeping peacefully under the blankets. A sudden wave of protectiveness washed over her. Who were these people? What did they want? A sharp knock on the door made her jump. Her first instinct was to ignore it, until she heard Sophia's voice. Open the door, Naomi. Naomi tensed. She didn't want to deal with Sophia. Not now. Not ever. But something about her tone made her uneasy. Naomi unlocked the door and opened it just enough to meet Sophia's icy gaze. What do you want? Naomi said, her voice sharp. Sophia smirked, but it didn't reach her eyes. You have two choices, she said, stepping closer. Either you leave on your own, or you get dragged out. Naomi's stomach twisted. Is that a threat? Sophia's smile widened. It's a promise. Then, as if she hadn't just threatened her, Sophia turned and walked away. Naomi's hands were shaking as she shut the door. First the phone call. Now this. It was happening. Someone wanted her gone, and she was running out of time. That afternoon, Naomi made a decision. She had to get Ethan out. She had to leave, before it was too late. She grabbed a suitcase and began stuffing clothes inside, her hands moving fast. She would take Ethan and disappear before Zoe or Sophia could stop her. She had done it before. She could do it again. She had to. But before she could zip up the bag, the door burst open. Zane stood in the doorway, his eyes dark, his expression unreadable. His gaze landed on the half-packed suitcase. "What the hell are you doing?" Naomi swallowed hard. "I'm leaving." "The hell you are." She clenched her jaw. "You don't control me, Zane." "No," he said coldly, "but I have a right to my son." Naomi flinched. That word. His. Ethan wasn't his. He wasn't his to claim. "I raised him," she said, her voice shaking. "You don't just get to come in and—" "I didn't know, Naomi." Zane's voice finally cracked. "If I had known, but you didn't," she interrupted. "You weren't there. You weren't there when I had to work 2 jobs to feed him. You weren't there when he got sick, and I had to beg a pharmacist for medicine I couldn't afford. You weren't there when he woke up crying, asking why he didn't have a dad." Her voice broke. "You weren't there, Zane." Silence. A long, painful silence. Then Zane whispered, "I know." Naomi sucked in a shaky breath. "Then let us go." Zane's eyes darkened. "I can't." Naomi's stomach dropped. Zane stepped forward, his voice quieter but firm. "You can leave if you want," he said. "But Ethan stays with me." Naomi's blood turned to ice. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw it. Zayn Malik wasn't just a man. He was powerful, and he wasn't going to let her go, not without a fight. Naomi gritted her teeth, stepping closer until they were eye to eye. "Then you better be ready, Zayn," she whispered, "because I will never let you take my son from me." Zayn's jaw clenched. A war had begun, and neither of them was backing down. Naomi's hands trembled as she clutched Ethan's tiny fingers in her own. She crouched in front of him, her heart pounding, as she whispered urgently, "Sweetheart, we have to go. Right now." Ethan blinked up at her, sleepy and confused. "Mommy, what's wrong?" Everything. Everything was wrong. Naomi forced a smile, even as panic surged through her veins. "We're going on a little adventure, okay? But we have to be quiet." She grabbed the suitcase she had hurriedly packed and lifted Ethan into her arms. They had to leave before Zayn stopped them. Before his power, his influence, and his sheer determination trapped them in a life she never asked for. But the second she cracked open the door, her heart dropped. 2 of Zayn's guards stood at the end of the hallway, their dark suits blending into the shadows. Their expressions were unreadable, but their presence screamed one thing: "You're not going anywhere." Naomi's pulse spiked. They knew. Zayn knew. A slow, deliberate voice echoed behind her. "Going somewhere?" She stiffened. Zayn stood at the other end of the hallway, his posture calm, but his eyes, those eyes, burned with intensity. He wasn't angry. No, he was resolved. Naomi spun around, holding Ethan tighter. "Move," she said through gritted teeth. Zayn took a step forward. "You're making a mistake, Naomi." "My mistake," she spat, "was trusting you." His jaw clenched, but his voice remained even. "I never lied to you." "You withheld the truth," she shot back. "You had Sophia do a DNA test on my child, without my permission. You invaded my life, and now you want to claim my son like he's some prize?" Zayn exhaled sharply. "He is my son." Naomi shook her head furiously. "He's my son. I raised him. I protected him. I fought for him when no one else did." Her voice cracked. "Where were you when he needed a father, Zayn?" A flicker of something, guilt, pain, flashed across his face, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "I didn't know, Naomi." "Well, now you do, and I'm leaving." Zayn took another step forward. "No, you're not." She sucked in a sharp breath. "You can't keep me here." "I'm not keeping you," he said, voice low. But Ethan stays. Naomi froze. A chilling fear wrapped around her spine. What? Zane's expression was unreadable. I won't let you take my son from me. Naomi's stomach twisted. The reality of the situation hit her like a hurricane. She wasn't just running from Zane. She was running from his power, his money, his influence, and he could use all of it to take Ethan away from her. She swallowed hard, gripping Ethan closer. You wouldn't. Zane held her gaze. I don't want to, Naomi, but I will not lose my son. Terror clawed at her throat. She had no resources, no money, no power. If this turned into a legal battle, she wouldn't stand a chance. She needed another plan. Slowly, she let out a shaky breath and relaxed her stance. Fine. Zane's eyes narrowed slightly, as if sensing the shift. Fine? She forced herself to nod. I won't leave. Not yet. A beat of silence. Then Zane gave a slow nod. Good. But Naomi wasn't staying. Not for him. Not for his power. She was waiting for the right moment to escape. Naomi lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. Her heart was still racing from her confrontation with Zane. Her body buzzed with restless energy, but she knew she had to wait. She had to be smart. Zane would be watching her now. The guards would be watching too. She turned her head to look at Ethan, curled up beside her, sleeping peacefully. She gently ran her fingers through his curls, her chest aching with love and fear. She had to get him out. But how? A quiet knock on her door made her stiffen. She sat up, clutching the blanket, as the door creaked open. Sophia stood there, her expression unreadable. Naomi's stomach turned. What do you want? Sophia stepped inside and closed the door behind her. We need to talk. Naomi crossed her arms. I have nothing to say to you. Sophia arched a brow. Even if I told you I have a way for you to escape. Naomi's breath hitched. Sophia gave a slow, calculated smile. I can get you and Ethan out of here. Tonight. Naomi narrowed her eyes. Why would you help me? Sophia shrugged. Let's just say Zane isn't the only one with power, and I'd rather see you gone than see you stay. Every instinct screamed not to trust her, but Naomi had no other option. She had to take the risk. What's the plan? She whispered. Sophia smirked. Be ready in an hour. Naomi watched as she turned and left, her mind spinning. Was this a trap, or was it her only way out? Naomi's heart pounded as she crept down the hallway, holding Ethan tightly in her arms. Sophia had instructed her to meet outside the back gate of the estate. The guards would be on their usual rounds. There was a small window of time. Her breath came in shaky bursts as she tiptoed through the shadows. Almost there. Almost free. A car sat waiting by the gate, its engine running. A man sat in the driver's seat, wearing a black suit. Sophia stood beside it, arms crossed. Naomi's stomach twisted. Something felt wrong. She slowed her steps, gripping Ethan closer. Who's he? She whispered. Sophia sighed, impatient. A driver. Stop asking questions and get in. Naomi's feet stayed planted. Every instinct screamed danger. Naomi, Sophia hissed. Do you want to leave or not? Naomi's pulse pounded. Something was off, very off. Then, a click. The driver's side door opened, and the man stepped out. And Naomi saw it, a gun tucked into his waistband. Her heart stopped. Sophia smiled. You didn't really think I'd let you get away, did you? Terror gripped Naomi's spine. It was a setup. A scream barely left her lips before a hand clamped over her mouth. She struggled, kicking and thrashing, as the man grabbed her from behind. Run, baby! She gasped against the hand covering her mouth. Run! Ethan's eyes widened in terror. But before he could move, Sophia's hand snatched his wrist. Ethan screamed. Naomi's world collapsed. Then, a gunshot, a shout of pain, and then Zane, charging through the darkness, rage burning in his eyes. His guards swarmed, taking down the man who had grabbed Naomi. Sophia gasped as Zane grabbed her by the arm, his grip so tight she winced. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," he growled. Naomi collapsed to the ground, sobbing as she pulled Ethan into her arms. Zane crouched beside them, his hands trembling as he brushed a curl from Ethan's face. "Are you okay?" he whispered. Ethan nodded, clutching his shirt. Naomi looked at Zane, and for the first time she realized she wasn't running anymore. She was fighting, and she wasn't fighting alone. Naomi's body trembled as she clutched Ethan against her chest. His little arms wrapped around her neck, his face buried in her shoulder. His heartbeat pounded against hers, fast and frightened. Zane stood just feet away, his broad shoulders rising and falling, with deep, controlled breaths. The fury in his eyes burned hot enough to melt steel. His grip on Sophia's wrist tightened as he hissed, "You dared to lay a hand on my son?" Sophia struggled, her face contorted with pain and defiance. "You're a fool, Zane. Do you think she belongs here? Do you really think this woman is worth throwing everything away?" Zane's jaw clenched, his entire body radiating restrained violence. "You just tried to kidnap my son. Your opinions mean nothing to me." Sophia's smirk wavered. For the first time, there was fear in her eyes. "I did what needed to be done. If you won't protect the family's legacy, I will." A flicker of something dark passed over Zane's face. "Legacy? Is that what this is about?" His voice dropped to a lethal whisper. "Let me make one thing clear, Sophia. Ethan is my family now. Naomi is my family. And you are nothing to me." Sophia's breath hitched. The words hit their mark. Naomi watched, gripping Ethan tighter. She should have felt relieved, but she knew better than to think this was over. Not yet. Zane turned to one of his guards. "Take her back to the estate. Do not let her leave until I decide what to do with her." The guard grabbed Sophia's arm and started dragging her away. "You'll regret this, Zane," she spat over her shoulder. "You think she loves you? She'll leave you the second she gets the chance." Naomi stiffened. Zane didn't even blink. He just exhaled slowly, as if letting the venomous words evaporate into the night. Then he turned to Naomi. Their eyes met. The world narrowed to just the two of them. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice was quieter now, but the intensity hadn't faded. Naomi swallowed hard. "Number. But Ethan?" "I'm okay, Mommy," Ethan whispered, though his grip on her remained tight. Zane's gaze softened as he crouched beside them. He reached out, hesitated, then gently touched Ethan's back. "You were very brave," he murmured. "I'm proud of you." Ethan sniffled. "Are you mad at me?" Zane blinked, caught off guard. "Why would I be mad?" "Because I was scared." Zane exhaled sharply, then shook his head. "Being scared doesn't make you weak. It means you have something worth fighting for." His eyes flicked to Naomi. "And you do." Naomi felt something tighten in her chest, a dangerous warmth. This wasn't the Zayn Malik she had first met, the cold, distant billionaire who controlled every aspect of his life with an iron grip. This was someone else, someone she wasn't sure she could afford to let in. Zayn stood, clearing his throat. "Let's get back to the house." Naomi hesitated. "And then what?" Zayn's expression darkened. "Then we finish this." The ride back to Zayn's mansion was silent. Naomi sat in the back seat too, with Ethan curled up in her arms, his breathing finally slowing. Zayn sat across from them, his elbows resting on his knees, his fingers laced together. The tension was thick, but Naomi wasn't sure if it came from what had just happened. or what was still to come. When they arrived, Naomi expected Zane to send her and Ethan to their rooms, but instead, he led them straight to his office. The room was massive. Dark mahogany shelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound books. A decanter of whiskey sat untouched on the sleek black desk. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city below, the skyline glittering like a bed of stars. Zane gestured for Naomi to sit, but she remained standing, holding Ethan. "I don't understand," she said finally. "What exactly are we doing here?" Zane ran a hand through his hair, looking more exhausted than she'd ever seen him. "We need to talk." Naomi's grip on Ethan tightened. "About what?" "About what happens next." Her stomach twisted. "Zane, if you think I'm staying here after this, you're not leaving," he interrupted. His voice was calm but absolute. Naomi's breath hitched. "Excuse me?" Zane took a step closer, his eyes locking onto hers. "Sophia may be in custody now, but she's not the only problem." A chill ran down Naomi's spine. "What do you mean?" Zane hesitated. Then, as if coming to a decision, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a file. He slid it across the desk toward her. She didn't move. "What is that?" "Proof," Zane said, "that this goes deeper than just Sophia." Naomi's heart pounded as she stepped forward and picked up the file. She flipped it open. Her blood ran cold. Inside were surveillance photos of her, of Ethan, of their tiny apartment before all of this began. And next to them, a list of transactions, money, transfers, names she didn't recognize. Her hands shook as she whispered, "What is this?" Zane's jaw clenched. "It's a contract." Naomi lifted her eyes. "For what?" Zane exhaled. "For you." The room tilted. Naomi stumbled back. "No. I found it in Sophia's personal files. She wasn't just trying to get rid of you, Naomi. She was going to sell you." The words barely registered. A wave of nausea slammed into Naomi as she looked back at the file, her vision blurring. This wasn't just about keeping her away from Zane. This was about getting rid of her entirely. Sophia hadn't just wanted Naomi out of Zane's life. She had planned to make sure she never came back. Her stomach twisted violently. "You're saying she was going to—" "Yes," Zane said. "And if I hadn't stopped her tonight, I don't know what would have happened." Naomi couldn't breathe. She pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to keep from screaming. Ethan stirred in her arms, his small voice muffled against her shoulder. "Mommy!" Naomi forced herself to swallow the terror. She smoothed a hand over his curls. "It's okay, baby." Zane's expression softened as he stepped forward. "Naomi, I need you to understand. I will not let anything happen to you." She looked up at him, eyes wide. I don't know what to do." "You don't have to do anything," Zane said. "Just trust me." Naomi didn't trust easily. But tonight, as she looked at the man in front of her, the man who had just risked everything to keep her safe, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in this fight anymore. The silence in Zane's office was suffocating. The only sound was the rustling of papers as Naomi turned page after page, her fingers trembling. Every document, every photograph. Proof of a conspiracy house she had unknowingly been trapped in. Zane stood near his desk, his hands shoved into his pockets, his jaw tight with restrained emotion. He was watching her, waiting. Finally, Naomi looked up, her throat dry. "How long have you known?" Zane exhaled slowly. "Not long. A few days before Sophia made her move, I started getting suspicious. There were too many coincidences, too many secrets. So, I started digging." Naomi's pulse pounded in her ears. "And what exactly did you find?" Zane hesitated, then said quietly, "That 6 years ago, I met a woman. I don't remember her face. I don't remember her name. But I remember that night. Naomi's fingers clenched around the edges of the file. Zane ran a hand through his hair, looking away. I was in Miami for a business deal. It was a charity gala, a high-profile event. I was drunk, reckless. I barely remember anything, except waking up alone in a hotel suite the next morning. No name, no trace of who she was. Naomi's stomach twisted. Zane's gaze met hers again, sharp and filled with something unreadable. That was the night you got pregnant, wasn't it? Naomi's breath hitched. She felt the weight of the moment settle on her chest, heavy and unrelenting. She had never known who Ethan's father was. She had never wanted to know. It had been one reckless night, a moment of escape from the crushing reality of her life. Now, standing here in Zayn Malik's office, staring at the man who had unknowingly fathered her son. It felt impossible. Zayn stepped closer, his voice low. Naomi, is Ethan mine? She opened her mouth, closed it. The answer was obvious. It had been obvious from the moment she saw the DNA results, from the way Zayn had protected Ethan, from the way Ethan had unknowingly clung to him as if he belonged there. Still, the words felt impossible to say. Zayn didn't push. He just waited. Finally, Naomi whispered, yes. A long silence stretched between them. Zayn exhaled sharply, his hands gripping the desk behind him, as if he needed something solid to hold on to. I have a son. Naomi flinched at the rawness in his voice. Zayn's gaze dropped to Ethan, who was still asleep on the couch, oblivious to the storm unraveling around him. The silence between them stretched. Naomi's mind raced. What was he thinking? Was he angry? Regretful? Then Zayn whispered, almost to himself, I lost 6 years. Naomi's chest tightened. I didn't know, she said quickly. I didn't even remember your name. I never tried to find you. I know, Zayn murmured. He was staring at Ethan, his expression unreadable. Then slowly his fingers curled into fists. Naomi hesitated, then asked the question she wasn't sure she wanted the answer to. What happens now? Zayn turned to her. His expression was dark, determined. Now, I make up for lost time. The following morning, Naomi woke up to a different Zayn. He was no longer the cold, distant billionaire who operated with precision and control. Now, he was a father, and he was determined to protect his son. Naomi had barely stepped into the dining room when Zayn's deep voice greeted her. We need to talk. She froze. He was seated at the long dining table, a cup of black coffee in his hand, his suit pristine as ever. Ethan sat beside him, munching on a croissant, completely unaware of the tension crackling in the air. Naomi cleared her throat. About what? Zayn leaned back, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. About the fact that you're not leaving. Naomi's breath caught. Zayn, you and Ethan are staying here, with me. A shiver ran down Naomi's spine. This was a command, not a request. She set down her coffee, her fingers tightening around the ceramic. You can't just decide that. Zayn's eyes darkened. Yes, I can. And I just did. Naomi's stomach churned. This isn't how this works. Ethan's my son. I've been raising him alone for 6 years. And now you don't have to, Zayn interrupted. His voice was calm, but there was something undeniable in his tone, something final. Naomi's pulse quickened. Zayn, this isn't just about you. I don't even know if what? Zayn asked. If you can trust me? Naomi swallowed. Yes, Zayn exhaled. His fingers tapped lightly against the table. Then he said, what would it take? Naomi blinked. What? Zayn's gaze burned into hers. What would it take for you to trust me? To believe that I want to protect you and Ethan? That I won't hurt you? Naomi didn't know. How could she? She had spent 6 years building walls around her and her son, ensuring no one could break them down. And now this man, this stranger, was asking her to tear them all down overnight. She glanced at Ethan. He was watching their conversation quietly, his small fingers gripping his fork. Her son. Zane was right about one thing. Naomi exhaled, setting her jaw. Time. Zane raised an eyebrow. I need time, she said firmly, to adjust, to figure things out, to see if I can trust you. Zane nodded slowly, as if considering. Then he stood. He adjusted his cufflinks, his eyes never leaving hers. Fine. Take all the time you need. Naomi blinked. Just like that? Zane smirked. For now. Naomi felt uneasy. Zayn Malik wasn't a man who let things go, and she had a feeling that when he made up his mind about something, he never backed down. That evening, as Naomi was tucking Ethan into bed, she heard a knock at the door. She turned, surprised to find Zayn leaning against the doorway. Can we talk? He asked. Naomi hesitated, then nodded. She followed him down the hall to a quiet sitting room. The city lights stretched beyond the glass windows, casting the room in a dim glow. Zayn ran a hand through his hair, looking more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. Naomi, I don't want to fight with you. She crossed her arms. Then don't. He exhaled a quiet laugh. It's not that simple. No, she agreed. It's not. Zayn studied her for a long moment. Then he said, I don't just want to be a name on Ethan's birth certificate, Naomi. Her breath caught. I want to be his father. Naomi's heart stopped. Zayn's voice was raw, honest. I missed 6 years. I can't change that, but I can make sure I don't miss any more. Naomi swallowed hard. And what if I'm not ready to let you? Zayn's lips curved into a slow, knowing smirk. Then, I'll just have to prove myself to you. Zayn had always been a man who thrived on control. Every decision, every calculated move, had been meticulously planned. Yet, standing in his office, staring out at the sprawling Los Angeles skyline, he felt something completely unfamiliar. Helplessness. Naomi's revelations had shaken him to his core. Ethan was his son. The thought alone was enough to send a rush of emotions through him. Regret for the years lost, anger at the circumstances that kept him from knowing the truth, but above all, determination. He had sworn to himself that no one would ever take away what belonged to him. And now, that included Naomi and Ethan. But it wasn't just his past mistakes that threatened his newfound family. The storm that had been brewing for weeks was about to explode. It started with whispers, rumors slipping through the cracks of high society, trickling down into the press like poison. A headline broke the next morning. Billionaire Zayn Malik's secret love child. Who is the mysterious mother? The article was brutal. It painted Naomi as a gold digger, suggesting she had orchestrated this entire situation to trap Zayn into fatherhood. The piece dragged up her past, her financial struggles, even her employment at the cafe. Every insecurity Naomi had tried to bury was now laid bare for the world to see. Naomi sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone in disbelief. This can't be happening, she whispered. The sound of Ethan's laughter echoed from the next room, completely unaware of the war being waged over his very existence. A knock at the door snapped Naomi out of her daze. She already knew who it was. Zayn stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, the calm before the storm. Pack a bag, he said firmly. Naomi frowned. What? You and Ethan are coming with me, now. Naomi set her jaw. I'm not running away just because the media. This isn't just the media, Naomi. Zayn stepped inside, shutting the door behind him, His voice was dangerously low. Sophia started this, but she's not the only one trying to destroy you. Naomi's heart pounded. What are you talking about? Zane clenched his jaw. I have enemies, people who want to see me fall, and they will use you and Ethan to do it. Naomi swallowed hard. You think they'll hurt us? Zane didn't answer right away, but the look in his eyes told her everything. She didn't argue after that. An hour later, Naomi found herself stepping into a sleek, modern penthouse in Malibu. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the ocean, the waves crashing gently against the shore. She turned to Zane. What is this place? A safe house. His voice was clipped. Only a handful of people know about it. Ethan ran ahead, his small face lighting up as he explored the massive space. Naomi watched him with a pang of guilt. This wasn't fair to him. She turned back to Zane. We can't just hide here forever. Zane met her gaze. No, we can't. But we need time to figure out our next move. Naomi exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. And what exactly is our next move? Zane's expression darkened. Finding out who is behind this. Naomi frowned. I thought it was Sophia. It was, Zane admitted. But she's not working alone. Naomi felt a chill creep down her spine. What do we do? She asked. Zane stepped closer, his voice steady. We fight. For the next few days, Zane's team worked to trace the source of the leaks. Every article, every scandalous detail, they all led back to a single source, a family insider. Sophia had always been ruthless. But this was war. Late one evening, Zane called a meeting at the safe house. The air was thick with tension as his most trusted advisors gathered. Zane folded his arms. Tell me. His security chief, Omar, set a folder down in front of him. We traced the information back to Sophia, but... He hesitated. But what? Zane pressed. Omar exhaled. She had help from someone inside the Malik Corporation. Naomi's stomach twisted. Who? Omar flipped open the folder, revealing a series of documents. Naomi's eyes widened. It wasn't just Sophia. It was his uncle, Rashid Malik. Zane's hands curled into fists. That son of a... Omar interrupted. That's not all. He's also been funding efforts to have Naomi declared an unfit mother. If that happens, she'll lose Ethan. Naomi's breath hitched. They're trying to take my son away from me. Zane stood so quickly, his chair scraped against the floor. Like hell they will. Naomi gripped the edge of the table. How do we stop them? Zane's eyes darkened. We end this. Publicly. That night, Naomi stood by the window, staring out at the ocean. She felt Zane step up behind her. You're quiet, he said. Naomi turned to him, her eyes burning with emotion. They want to take Ethan from me. Zane's gaze softened. He reached out, cupping her cheek. I won't let them. Naomi's throat tightened. I'm scared, Zane. Zane's grip on her tightened. So am I. Naomi searched his face. Then what are we doing? Zane exhaled. Fighting? Naomi closed her eyes. And if we lose? Zane leaned down, brushing his lips against her forehead. Then we fight harder. For the first time in days, Naomi felt a sliver of hope. She wasn't alone. They weren't alone. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The following morning, Zane took control of the narrative. He released a statement confirming that Ethan was his son, denouncing the lies that had been spread about Naomi. He didn't beg for privacy. He demanded it. Sophia and Rashid, however, weren't backing down. The next headline: Malik family feud. The battle over a billionaire's son. The war had officially begun. The world had become a battlefield. Zayn Malik was no longer just a billionaire businessman. He was a man at war, not just with the media, not just with his family, but with everyone who dared to threaten what was his. And at the center of it all was Naomi Carter. She had been dragged into this war because of him. And now she and Ethan were paying the price. Zayn had vowed to protect them. But some battles couldn't be fought behind closed doors. This was one of them. Naomi sat at the kitchen counter in the safe house, her fingers gripping the edge of her coffee mug. She hadn't slept much, not after the latest round of headlines. Naomi Carter, the billionaire's mistress, or manipulative opportunist? Zayn Malik's family speaks out. She's destroying our legacy. Every word felt like a knife to the chest. But this wasn't just about her reputation anymore. It was about Ethan, her son, the little boy who still ran to her bed at night when he had nightmares, the little boy who thought his mother was the strongest person in the world. She couldn't let them take him away. A chair scraped against the floor, pulling Naomi from her thoughts. She looked up to see Zayn, his jaw set tight, eyes dark with exhaustion. "You need to see something," he said, sliding his phone toward her. Naomi hesitated, then picked it up. Her stomach dropped. It was a leaked email, and not just any email. An official court petition filed under Rashid Malik's name. The request? Full custody of Ethan Malik. Naomi's hand began to tremble. "He's trying to take him," she whispered. Zayn nodded, his expression lethal. "I won't let that happen." Naomi swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. "What do we do?" Zayn's eyes burned with dangerous resolve. "We end this. Tonight." Zayn wasn't the only one who wanted answers. Sophia Rashid had spent her entire life protecting the Malik legacy. She had been raised to believe that family was everything, that their name was sacred. And then, Naomi Carter happened. She had spent weeks trying to destroy her, and yet Zayn still chose her. And now, Rashid was making his final move. Sophia sat in her private villa, swirling a glass of wine, when her phone rang. She smirked. She had been expecting this call. When she answered, Rashid's voice was cold. "We need to talk." By nightfall, Naomi and Zayn were back at his estate. It had been weeks since Naomi had last stepped foot in his Beverly Hills mansion. The last time she had been here, she had felt like an outsider. Now, she was a target. Zayn led her inside, his security detail twice as tight as before. Every window, every entrance. He wasn't taking any chances. As they reached his office, Zayn turned to her. "No matter what happens tonight," he said, his voice low, "stay by my side." Naomi nodded, but neither of them could have predicted what was coming. Zayn had expected Rashid to fight dirty. He had expected Sophia to stab him in the back. What he hadn't expected? His own father. The moment Zayn walked into the meeting, he felt it, the weight of betrayal. Rashid sat at the long conference table, a calm smirk on his face. Sophia stood beside him, arms crossed. And at the head of the table, Zayn's father, Khalid Malik. Zayn's entire body went rigid. He turned to Rashid, his voice a deadly whisper. "You dragged my father into this." The war had begun. Zayn Malik had always been a man of control, calculating, powerful, untouchable. But tonight, he was none of those things. Tonight, he was a man willing to risk everything. For Naomi, for Ethan, for a future he never thought possible. And he knew the cost. Because in a battle like this, someone always had to lose. Naomi couldn't breathe. She sat in the dimly lit apartment, her hands gripping her phone, scrolling through headline after headline. Billionaire Zayn Malik declares war on his own family. Secret son exposed. The custody battle begins. Naomi Carter, From waitress to homewrecker, every word felt like a punch to the gut. And it wasn't just the press. It was everyone. The threats had started rolling in almost immediately. Anonymous calls, messages, even people showing up at the cafe where she used to work. She wasn't safe. Neither was Ethan. A knock on the door sent a bolt of fear through her spine. She grabbed Ethan, pulling him close. "Who is it?" she called out, voice shaking. "It's me, Zane." Naomi hesitated, then opened the door. Zane stepped inside, his expression dark, dangerous. "We need to talk," he said. "Now." Zane paced the room like a caged animal. His entire world was crumbling. His business partners were withdrawing investments. His name was being dragged through the mud, and his own father had threatened to cut him off completely. But none of that mattered. What mattered was Naomi. What mattered was Ethan, and keeping them safe. "I have a plan," Zane said, "but you're not going to like it." Naomi's stomach dropped. "What kind of plan?" she asked. Zane stopped pacing. He turned to her, his gaze piercing. "You and Ethan have to disappear." Naomi froze. She shook her head. "No. It's the only way," Zane insisted. "Rashid is coming for you. My father. He won't stop until Ethan is out of your hands." Naomi's heart pounded. "But if we leave," her voice cracked. "That means leaving you." Zane swallowed hard. "I know." The words hit her like a truck. After everything they had been through, this was how it had to end. "No," she whispered. "I won't do it." Zane stepped closer, his hands gripping hers. "You have to," he said, his voice pleading. "I can take the heat, Naomi. I can fight this battle. But Ethan, he's just a kid. And you shouldn't have to live like this." Tears filled Naomi's eyes. "You're asking me to run. I'm asking you to survive." Zane had prepared everything. A new identity. A safe house outside the country. A way for Naomi and Ethan to start over somewhere far away. No more threats. No more danger. But it meant leaving him behind. Naomi sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the plane tickets in her hands. "This isn't fair," she whispered. Zane knelt in front of her, his forehead resting against hers. "I know." She closed her eyes, breathing in his scent, trying to memorize everything about him. His warmth, his voice, the way he always made her feel safe. She didn't want to go. But deep down, she knew Zane was right. Ethan came first. He would always come first. The car was waiting. The bags were packed. Naomi stood at the airport terminal, Ethan's small hand clutching hers. Zane stood across from her, his expression unreadable. "Come with us," Naomi begged. Zane's jaw tightened. "I can't." "Yes, you can," she argued. "We can start over, together." Zane shook his head. "So if I leave now, they'll hunt us down," he said. "I have to stay. I have to finish this." Naomi's heart shattered. She turned to Ethan, kneeling to his level. "You're going to go on an adventure, okay?" she said, forcing a smile. "We'll be safe." Ethan looked up at Zane, his small face confused. "Is Daddy coming too?" he asked. Zane flinched. For a moment, he looked like he was about to break. Then he knelt in front of Ethan, his hands on his son's shoulders. "I need you to take care of Mommy," Zane said softly. "Can you do that for me?" Ethan nodded. Zane smiled through the pain. "That's my boy." Naomi felt the tears spill down her cheeks as she stepped forward, wrapping her arms tightly around Zane. "Promise me," she whispered. "Promise me you'll come back." Zane held her so tight, it hurt. "I swear." A voice over the intercom announced their flight. Naomi pulled away. Zane watched as she took Ethan's hand and turned toward the gate. He watched until she disappeared from view. And then he was alone. Zayn walked out of the airport, the world feeling empty, his hands clenched into fists. It wasn't over. If Rashid and his father thought they had won, they were wrong. Zayn would fight. He would take back his family, and he would burn the entire empire down if he had to. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Zayn Malik had never lost a battle in his life. But this one was different. This time, he wasn't just fighting for his name, his power, or his empire. He was fighting for his family, and he would burn everything to the ground before he let anyone take them from him. The war had begun, and this time, he wouldn't stop until he won. The night Naomi left, Zayn felt emptier than ever before. The penthouse was silent, too silent. For years he had lived in luxury, a world of power, control, and wealth. But now none of it meant anything. He sat in his office, staring at the documents spread out before him. Evidence, witness statements, financial transactions, all of it pointed to Rashid. His own cousin had tried to destroy him, and Zayn was done playing defense. Naomi had tried to start over. She really had. The new apartment in Paris was beautiful, the streets full of life, and Ethan was finally smiling again. But she wasn't safe. No matter how far she ran, she knew they were still watching her. The calls started 3 days after they arrived. At first, they were just silent. Then came the whispers, "You can't hide forever. He can't protect you now." One morning, Naomi woke up to find a letter slid under her door. A single sentence was written in blood-red ink. "You took something that doesn't belong to you." Her blood ran cold. She grabbed Ethan and ran. She had to call Zayn. She had no choice. Zayn was waiting for it. The moment his phone rang, he already knew. He answered immediately. "Naomi," he said, voice tight. "What happened?" I think they found us." Zayn's jaw clenched. "Where are you?" "Paris." "But Zayn, I'm on my way." "No," Naomi said quickly. "If you come here, I don't care." His voice was sharp, lethal. "You and Ethan are mine, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take you away from me." The call went silent. Naomi didn't argue, because deep down, she wanted him to come. Zayn's jet landed in Paris by morning. But he wasn't alone. He had brought his own army, security, lawyers, investigators. This wasn't just about saving Naomi anymore. This was about ending the war, once and for all. The moment he stepped into the apartment, Naomi ran to him. She didn't care about the past, didn't care about the fight. She just needed him. And when Zayn wrapped his arms around her, holding her like she was the only thing that mattered in the world, she knew. She had never felt safer. But the moment of peace didn't last. Because across the street, Rashid was watching, and he was ready to strike. Zayn knew what Rashid wanted. It was never about money. It was never about power. It was about control. And now that Ethan existed, now that the truth was out, Rashid wanted to erase everything Zayn had built. The legal attack came first. A lawsuit. A custody battle. Claims that Naomi was an unfit mother. That Ethan belonged with his true family. But Zayn had anticipated this. His lawyers were already moving. His contacts were already working. But Rashid wasn't playing fair, because the threats didn't stop. One night, Naomi's apartment was broken into. The place was trashed, and on Ethan's bed, a knife plunged into his stuffed bear. That was the moment Naomi realized. This wasn't just a battle. This was a war, and someone wasn't going to survive it. Zayn knew Rashid wouldn't stop, so he took the fight to him. A meeting was arranged, one-on-one. No security, no lawyers, just Zayn and Rashid. It took place in an abandoned warehouse, in the outskirts of the city. Rashid sat at a table, sipping his whiskey like he had already won. You can't win this, Rashid said smoothly. Zayn didn't sit. He just stared. You touched my family, Zayn said, his voice deadly calm. That was your first mistake. Rashid smirked. And my second. Zayn leaned in, thinking I wouldn't kill you for it. For the first time, Rashid hesitated. Because Zayn wasn't just a billionaire. He was a man with nothing left to lose. And that made him the most dangerous man in the world. Zayn didn't need to pull the trigger, because he had already won. The documents were already filed. The police had everything they needed. By morning, Rashid's name would be ruined, his business seized, his power gone. And he knew it. Zayn turned to leave, but Rashid made one last mistake. He reached for the gun under the table. But Zayn was faster. With one swift movement, he knocked the weapon aside, slamming Rashid into the wall. You tried to take my son from me, Zayn growled. You tried to destroy the only woman I've ever loved. Rashid gasped for air, his face pale. Zayn, please. But Zayn didn't care. He leaned in one last time. You lost. And with that, he walked away. Naomi was waiting. The moment Zayn stepped into the apartment, she rushed to him. Is it over? She whispered. Zayn cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a tear. Yes. She threw herself into his arms, sobbing. And for the first time in weeks, Ethan slept peacefully, because he was finally safe, and Zayn had kept his promise. Zayn had won the war. But could he win Naomi's heart again? That was the real battle. And it was just beginning. The danger was gone. For the first time in months, Naomi could breathe again. No more threats, no more fear. She should have been relieved. But instead, she was terrified. Because now, she had to face the truth about Zayn, the truth about herself, and the truth about what she felt for him. Naomi stood by the window, staring out at the city lights. Ethan was asleep in the next room, safe, happy, and completely unaware of the war that had been fought for him. But Naomi? She wasn't so sure. When Zayn walked in, she didn't turn. She just said, It's over, right? Zayn nodded, standing a few feet away. Yes. Naomi let out a breath, gripping the edge of the counter. Then why does it still feel like I'm waiting for the next disaster? Zayn sighed, stepping closer. Because you don't trust me, he said softly. Naomi flinched. Because he was right. Zayn had never pleaded for anything in his life. But for Naomi, he would beg if he had to. He reached out, brushing a loose curl from her face. I know I made mistakes, he said. I know I hurt you. But Naomi, I will spend the rest of my life proving to you that I won't fail you again. She swallowed hard, looking up at him. And for the first time, she saw the truth in his eyes. He meant it. He really did. But could she risk believing it? The next morning, Naomi woke up to laughter. For a moment, her heart stopped. She bolted out of bed, rushing into the living room. And what she saw made her freeze. Ethan was sitting on the floor, stacking blocks, and Zayn was next to him, helping him build. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. And then, Ethan turned to Zayn and said, Daddy, look. The world stopped. Naomi's vision blurred. Zayn's entire body went still. He stared at Ethan, his jaw clenching, his fingers gripping the edge of the carpet. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Then, in a voice so soft, Naomi barely heard it, he whispered, Say it again. Ethan grinned, pointing at the tower of blocks. Daddy, look. Zayn closed his eyes. And when he opened them, he was fighting back tears. Naomi's heart ached, because in that moment, she realized that Zayn had never truly wanted power, money, or revenge. He had just wanted this, a family. And for the first time in his life, he finally had one. That night, Naomi sat beside Zane on the balcony. The air was cool, the city lights glittering below. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then quietly Naomi said, "I saw the way you looked at him today." Zane exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "I wasn't sure if I'd ever hear it," he admitted. "I didn't even know if I deserved it." Naomi turned to face him. "You do." Zane's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto hers. "What?" She took a deep breath. "You deserve to be his father, Zane." His throat worked as he swallowed. "But do I deserve you?" Naomi hesitated, because that answer wasn't so easy. Zane had changed. Naomi could see it. He wasn't the cold, ruthless billionaire she had met at the cafe that night. He was different, softer, warmer, and completely devoted. She had spent so long running from him, from her feelings, from her fears. But now, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't afraid anymore. Naomi didn't say anything. She just reached out, slipping her fingers into Zane's. His entire body went still. And then, slowly, carefully, he laced his fingers through hers. No words, no promises, just a silent understanding. Naomi had made her choice. She wasn't going anywhere. And Zane? He would spend the rest of his life making sure she never regretted it. Zane had always been a man in control. Every deal, every decision, every calculated move. He had mastered them all. But for the first time in his life, he was terrified. Because this time, he wasn't making a business deal. He was betting everything, his heart, his future, his very soul, on one woman. And he had no idea if she would say yes. It had to be perfect, not extravagant, not flashy, just right. Zane had spent weeks preparing for this moment. A private flight to Dubai, a secluded oasis beneath the stars, a ring that held more meaning than any fortune he'd ever earned. Now there was only one thing left to do. Ask Naomi Carter to be his forever. Naomi was suspicious. "Dubai?" she repeated, staring at the first-class ticket Zane had handed her. Zane leaned against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. "Just for a few days." She folded her arms. "You really expect me to just drop everything and go?" Zane smirked. "Yes." Naomi narrowed her eyes. "Why?" Zane's smirk faded, and in its place, something different, something serious. "I just want to show you something," he said quietly. "That's all." Naomi studied him for a long time. Then, with a deep breath, she said, "Fine." Zane had booked the entire first-class cabin. It was luxurious, but Naomi barely noticed, because the tension between them was thicker than the clouds outside. Zane sat across from her, his fingers tapping absently against the armrest. Naomi sighed. "Okay, seriously? What's going on?" Zane met her gaze, and for a moment, she forgot how to breathe, because in his eyes, there was something raw, something vulnerable. "You'll see," he said. Naomi's stomach twisted, because suddenly she realized. She was afraid of what he was about to show her. The moment they landed, Naomi knew this wasn't just a trip. The black SUV drove them out of the city, into the vast golden dunes of the Arabian desert. And then, as the sun began to set, Naomi saw it. An oasis. It looked like something out of a dream. Palm trees swayed in the warm breeze. The crystal-clear water reflected the sky, now streaked in deep hues of orange and purple. And in the center of it all, a small table draped in white linen, lit by the soft glow of lanterns. Naomi's heart pounded. "Zane," she whispered. "What is this?" But Zane didn't answer. Not yet. He simply took her hand and led her into the moment that would change their lives forever. They ate under the stars. Naomi was silent. She could feel it, the weight of something unspoken, pressing between them. Finally, she set her fork down. "Okay," she said. "Enough. Just tell me." Zane exhaled, leaning back in his chair. For a long time, he didn't speak. Then, softly, carefully, he said, "I love you, Naomi." Naomi's breath caught. Zane's fingers curled into fists. "I don't expect you to say it back," he continued. "I don't expect anything. But I needed you to know. Because you are—" He let out a rough breath. "You are the only thing in my life that matters more than my name, more than my money, more than my pride." Naomi's chest ached. Because it was real. This wasn't some grand performance. This was a man stripped bare, giving her the one thing he had never given anyone, his heart. "Zane," she whispered. But before she could say anything else, Zane reached into his pocket. And when he pulled out the small velvet box, Naomi's world stopped. Zane dropped to one knee. The lanterns flickered. The desert breeze wrapped around them. And in the silence of the night, Zane opened the box. Inside was a ring. But not just any ring. It was simple, yet breathtaking. A delicate gold band engraved with two names intertwined. Zane. Naomi. Naomi's hands shook. Zane looked up at her, his expression open, raw, unguarded. "Naomi Carter," he murmured. "Will you marry me?" Naomi's heart pounded against her ribs, because she had never expected this, not from him, not like this. And yet, here he was, on one knee, looking at her like she was his entire world. Naomi should have hesitated. She should have thought about it. But the truth, she had known the answer for a long time. She just hadn't been ready to admit it. Until now. With tears in her eyes, she whispered, "Yes." Zane exhaled sharply, as if he had been holding his breath for an eternity. He slid the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling slightly. Then he stood and pulled her into his arms. Naomi melted into him, clutching the fabric of his shirt. And when his lips brushed against hers, it wasn't just a kiss. It was a promise. They stood there for a long time, just holding each other, just breathing together. Zane pressed his forehead against hers. "I love you," he whispered again. This time, Naomi didn't hesitate. "I love you too." And just like that, everything changed. Because this wasn't just a love story. This was a home, a family, a forever. And they had finally found it. The sun cast a golden glow over the crystal blue waters of the Arabian Gulf, illuminating the private estate where Naomi Carter's life had forever changed. Today wasn't just another day. Today was the beginning of a future she never imagined possible. A future where she was not just surviving, but truly living. Naomi stood by the massive balcony, the breeze brushing against her skin. Below her, the expansive gardens stretched endlessly, leading to a pristine beach, where Ethan's laughter echoed, her son, her heart. Just months ago, she had nothing. Now, she had everything. Not just wealth, not just luxury, but love, security, a home, and Zayn Malik. Ethan raced across the sand, his small feet leaving prints in the golden grains. "Zayn," he shouted, waving his tiny arms. "Come catch me." Zayn smirked, rolling up the sleeves of his white linen shirt. "You're getting faster, little man," he said, chasing after him. Naomi watched as Zayn effortlessly lifted Ethan into the air, spinning him around before pulling him into a hug. It was effortless. It was natural. Zayn was his father, whether by blood or by choice. And Ethan? He had never been happier. That afternoon, Naomi sat in the grand study, documents spread before her. A legal team had been working on it for weeks. She traced her fingers over the papers, her heart pounding, because at the top, in bold letters, was a name that changed everything. Ethan Malik. Zane sat beside her, watching her closely. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. Naomi turned to him, her eyes full of emotion. "I want to," she whispered. "Ethan deserves this. He deserves you." Zane swallowed, his usually calm exterior breaking. This wasn't about power. This wasn't about status. This was about a boy who finally had a father who would never leave him. 3 weeks later, Naomi found herself in the city of love, Paris. It wasn't just a honeymoon. It was a fresh start. They walked hand in hand along the Seine River, the Eiffel Tower glowing in the distance. Zane squeezed her fingers. "You trust me now?" he asked, his voice deep and warm. Naomi smiled. "With everything I have." And for the first time in her life, she meant it. One evening, as Naomi stepped into the luxurious penthouse suite, she noticed something different. Candles flickered, soft music played, and in the center of the room, a tiny white box sat on the table. Her breath hitched. Slowly she walked toward it. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid, and inside was a tiny pair of baby shoes. Naomi's heart stopped. Her vision blurred with unshed tears. And when she turned, she found Zane standing behind her, watching her carefully. "Naomi," he whispered. She covered her mouth, laughing and crying all at once. "We're having a baby?" she asked, her voice shaking. Zane's eyes softened. "Yes, Habibti," he murmured. "We are." And for the first time in her life, Naomi Carter knew without a doubt that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with the man who had changed everything, with the family she had fought for, and in a future brighter than she ever dreamed possible. This was more than just a love story. This was a fight for a family, a second chance at happiness, and a love that defied all odds. And it was only the beginning. Did you see that coming? Did their love story move you? Let's talk about it in the comments below. What was your favorite moment? What would you have done in Naomi's place? And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we have even more incredible stories coming your way. Stories of love, sacrifice, and second chances that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Don't miss out. Join us for the next unforgettable journey. Love.